Hello, hello. Welcome to Political Frenemies, the podcast where a conservative and a liberal Democrat talk politics but still remain friends. I'm Chris Newton. I'm a historian and I'm a former conservative defence policy advisor. And with me is Mathew Hulbert, Lib Dem activist and former councillor. What's up, Mathew?
Hello, Chris. Good to be with you once again. These weeks absolutely fly by, don't they? Between recordings, and the politics seems to go at a frightening breakneck pace as well. But we absolutely love it. You know, it's what we're here for. And there's been a lot of politics again this week. So the politicians are doing us a good favour, aren't they, on this podcast by doing and saying a lot.
There's always something to talk about in these podcasts, and we live through extraordinary times. And even this week, there's been a lot. There's been a lot on in terms of the British political scene. We've had a partial U-turn. We've had Labour partially U-turning on their winter fuel payments policy, which in any other week would have been the main story and we probably would have talked about it. But there's been other stuff going on. We've had a feud between Angela Rayner and Rachel Reeves.
Well, that may be overstating it, but yeah.
Well, let's just say Angela Rayner is on manoeuvres. Let's say that.
It does appear though. It absolutely appears so. But can I say to you, Chris, U-turn if you want to. That's what the lady's not for turning. So, that very famous phrase of your heroine, Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah. A piece of advice which Starmer doesn't seem to follow at all. Really, he seems to U-turn and flip-flop at every opportunity. But as I've said, any other week we would be discussing those stories because those are big political stories in themselves. But we've had some very important developments on the British diplomatic scene. We have the British reset, the British trade agreement, or the update to the trade deal between the UK and the EU. And we've also had a British deal with Mauritius over handing sovereignty over of the Chagos Islands. So this is big political diplomatic stuff, and that's what we're going to be focusing on today.
It is indeed. So and I think that we both need to feel a bit like Noel Edmonds or more recently Stephen Mulhern, because in a sense what we're talking about is deal or no deal, and so I think we might have just found the title for this for this episode of the podcast. But yeah, I'm excited. Let's do it.
Yeah, just one question. Ooh. Who do you prefer, Noel Edmonds or Stephen Mulhern?
Well, you see, me and my dear late mum actually. God rest her soul, we used to love Deal or No Deal when it was first on Channel 4. I mean, a nonsense of a show, really, because it is literally opening boxes, and a game of chance. But Noel Edmonds created such kind of drama around it that we found it compulsive viewing every weeknight on Channel 4. I must admit, I haven't watched as many episodes of it with Stephen Mulhern, but I like him. He's a perfectly nice, affable presenter. But part of me thinks that you can only ever do these shows the once, and when they return, perhaps they're never quite as good. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think anyone will beat Noel Edmonds. He is the person associated with it. But I think I like Stephen Mulhern as well. He's very good. I think he's very good at doing a deal or no deal. But I prefer him on In for a Penny. He's really funny on that show.
Yeah, he's great in that, and obviously that was kind of his original show. I also have to say that I really like him on Celebrity Catchphrase. I think that's just really nice, easy viewing.
But again, Roy Walker, no one can top him.
Well, indeed. Say what you see. That's all I can say.
Right.
We've suddenly turned into a TV podcast. So
let's get back to the politics, shall we? Let's do this. Okay, right. I don't really have a clever segue from that to this, to be honest. So let's move swiftly on to the politics. And as I said, we have two very important agreements between the UK and two actors. You have the UK and the EU deal. Just very quickly, what did the UK and the EU agree with? Dynamic alignment on food and agricultural standards, EU access to UK fishing rights, extended for 12 years because it was due up in this in this negotiation. Work towards a youth mobility scheme or youth experience scheme, whatever they're calling it now. But British travellers permitted to use e-gates, and a framework agreement on British access to European defence loans and contracts and so forth. And the Chagos deal is about now the British had control over the Chagos, or had sovereignty over the Chagos Islands. We are transferring sovereignty to Mauritius, and we have an important military base on in Diego Garcia, which we operate along with the Americans, and we're leasing that back for 99 years, and we're paying the Mauritians for the privilege as well. So I would say that they have caused controversy. Obviously, Remainers love the EU deal. Is what they sort of wanted, short of actual rejoining the European Union. And in my sector, the defence sector, there's been outrage in relation to transferring strategic territory. Is like bang in the middle of the Indian Ocean, very important, very important part of the world. It is important in terms of transporting. Is really a staging post, a large staging post onto the other side of the Indian Ocean and the Pacific, and ultimately people in the defense community are saying, why on earth are we doing this? We're transferring it for what we think is no reason. Now the government says there's legal reasons to do it, but we might get into that a little bit later. But I just want to get your initial reactions to the deals, especially the EU deal, because I think this is more your kind of thing. And is what do you think of Starmer's negotiating style?
So on these two things, Chris, I think me and you are going to no surprise here. We're going to differ on the UK EU deal in some respects, at least, but perhaps be in more agreement than you might think in regards to the Chagos Islands. So let's start with the UK EU reset. First of all, I think only the most hardened Brexiteer, and maybe this does include you, Chris, but I think only the most hardened Brexiteer would think that we didn't need some kind of reset in relations with the European Union. The fact is that, I think I'm going to quote Tony Blair again. I must stop doing that on these podcasts, but I think he said when he addressed the joint meeting of Congress that Britain is placed where it is. We are in Europe. Maybe if we were just off the United States, we obviously would be. Well, we are very friendly with the United States. I'm not saying we're not, but we're not. To quote Donald Trump on Canada, we're not the 51st state of the United States. We are where we are geographically, and that is very close to Europe, if not now. In the European Union, and so it's still our biggest marketplace. All of those countries in the European Union, so we need to be close to the EU. And I think only the most kind of hardened Brexiteer would think anything other than that. So of course, myself and my party welcomes the fact that there are some moves, at least, to have a thawing of relations between the UK and the EU. And so I was pleased to see the Prime Minister Keir Starmer and the EU Commission President Ursula von der Leyen and all of the officials, etc., coming together to do this deal. Now, do I think it's particularly a deal of great substance? No, I don't, from all that I've heard about it this week, and I've listened to lots of podcasts and other things talking about it across the full range of spectrum of views. But do I think that this is a good first step in terms of a thawing of relations, and a necessary one? Yeah, I absolutely do think that, and I think Keir Starmer can be relatively happy with his week. I wait to hear the details on things like the youth mobility scheme, something that the Lib Dems especially have been pushing on, and so I'm keen to see movement on that. But I have to say, it does rather, even though I welcome it, and my party, of course, we do, it does rather seem to go against what he was saying just last week, which is that he's cracking down on immigration and all the rest of it. Now, of course, youth mobility scheme isn't immigration in that sense, but it is people being allowed to move relatively freely amongst the European Union nations, obviously young people. And I very much welcome that. I think it's kind of our birthright that was taken away by Brexit. But I do think that Keir Starmer, especially for reform type voters and people like yourself, Chris, that he just seemed to be speaking out of both sides of his mouth on that. So I sometimes find with Keir Starmer that if you're looking for a coherent kind of long-term strategy, this guy is not the person to give you that. What do you think?
Yeah, no, I actually, you might be surprised on that point. I would agree with you. I mean, 1 minute he's talking about controlling immigration. He talked about the end of globalization, or was to that effect only a couple of weeks ago, and yet the EU is seen as kind of a symbol of that globalized world, of that supranational world. So the whole strategy is absolutely confused. I would take issue about our role relating to the continent. The European continent. Yes, Europe's important. European security is very important, but we are an island. We're not a continental power, and we're an island with historical connections to all over the world. And we're an island with maritime considerations, and this ties in with Chagos as well. Our principal concern is not the protection of land borders, it is the protection of commerce and seaborne commerce. And that it presents very different priorities to what our friends, when they behave like friends on the continent, prioritize. So in that sense, we have to remember that we have very different strategic cultures. But obviously my problem with this is that I think it unravels Brexit. I think the description that it's a betrayal of Brexit is 100% correct. We are becoming now rule takers without any say over the rules on food standards and agriculture in particular. And Starmer hasn't really negotiated a good deal, in the sense that we've negotiated certain things, even in relation to youth mobility, but without any of the details. So without any of the detail. So we've agreed to give certain money and for certain things, but there's no but we haven't agreed on the actual finalized deals in aspects relating to defense and youth mobility. And in terms of youth mobility, yes, this policy is going to benefit especially middle class young people who want to study and travel abroad. But what about the young people who are here and are now facing the prospect of being in competition with people from countries such as Spain, such as Italy, such as Greece and Sweden, that has, compared to us, a relatively high unemployment. And doesn't this just, ultimately young people might be cheering this deal, but ultimately young people are going to suffer as a result of this deal, because there's going to be more competition for jobs.
Well, I mean, that's life, isn't it, Chris? I mean,
But
there's
we
always
can
going
do
to be
something about it. We can
there's
say,
always
well,
going
we
to
don't
be
want to do that.
there's always going to be competition, whether domestic or international or both. But I think, I mean, you say just middle class kids. I mean, I'd like to think that there's schemes that will help working class kids, of which I was one. In fact, still consider myself working class, but obviously no longer a young person in that sense. But will benefit from too. And I think it was one of the great things of membership of the European Union, that people of whatever age, but especially young people, could travel freely across the EU and experience all that our wonderful European continent has to offer. And so we await to see the details. So yeah, I mean, I think that I hope lots of young people from across kind of the class spectrum and from all parts of the UK will get to benefit from this new scheme. I think it's really important. I think it's just about the most positive thing actually that's come out of this UK EU reset. But I mean, in my view, the specific details actually about what has been achieved here are almost secondary to the fact that there has been this reset and there's been a thawing of relations. And I mean, you don't hear me praising Keir Starmer very often on this podcast, but I think the EU leaders seem happier with him than they ever did any Conservative leader that tried to go to Europe.
Has there been a thawing of relations? Because the EU has been extremely demanding. For example, saying that there was reports during the negotiations that a condition on us accessing the defence arrangements, which I don't think I mean, the EU defence market has never been a huge market for us, because it's so protectionist. But demanding access on defence in return for access to fishing rights, and again, the politics on fishing is going to be big in the fishing in the coastal communities. And ultimately Starmer agreeing to that and agreeing for this 12-year extension on EU access to fish. Yeah, they love us because Starmer's just giving away everything to them.
Well, it's interesting, isn't it? I was just thinking there as you were saying that maybe this is another example of Starmer helping the people that are more likely to vote for him and not helping those that are not likely to vote for him. So, I mean, I'm not saying that's a good way to conduct government policy, but it does appear to factor into a lot of his thinking, given a lot of the decisions that he makes as prime minister. But maybe he believes that the fishing communities on the coast of this country are very unlikely to be voting Labour anyway. So, and yet, as you put it, middle class families with young people that can travel across the continent maybe are likely to consider voting for this Labour Party. So, in politics, I'm afraid, in the grubby world of politics, electoral considerations always come into play in terms of policies. The politicians might tell you that they don't, but of course we all know that they do. And so maybe that has been a consideration, Chris. What do you think?
I mean, it may be, but I think there's also electoral consequences as well. The potential electoral consequences. Now, it may be that Labour's calculated that it's almost 10 years since Brexit. People have moved on. People might not care, and people might, and there's polling to suggest that there's people want a closer relationship.
Isn't that? Let me just come in there, Chris, just to say that polling, you don't. I'm sure what you've said there is correct, but let's also say the other bit that there's quite a few polls that show that there's quite a bit of buyer's regret from people who voted for Brexit and who now think that it's done the country harm, which is, of course, my view.
I was about to say that, yeah. The polls, the polls are saying this and so forth. But I remember the polls saying this in 2019, and I remember people like you saying to me in 2019 that people are now seeing how much chaos Brexit will be,
I
and
was
there's
right.
buyer's remorse, and yet Boris won the landslide. So is Starmer? Is Starmer making the same mistake here? Is this on top of the Chagos agreement, which again is, in my view, totally unnecessary? The legal arguments are threat is overblown. It again exposes British weakness. It's very expensive. I'm sure the Tories and Reform are going to say that both the EU deal and the Chagos deal is going to cost us money when we could be paying it on winter fuel payments or whatever takes your fancy. And is this potentially, and I'm not saying that it is or not, because I don't know, I think it should be, is this potentially Starmer's poll tax moment, Iraq moment? I think obviously this trust has been treated unfairly, but let's just say a mini budget moment. Is this going to be so toxic for Labour that they've basically lost the election this week and they've handed Farage the keys to number 10?
Well, I certainly don't think that last thing is necessarily correct, because I know Reform are doing very well at the moment. Although I have to say already, and I think I'll be proven right in the long term on this as well, from what I said a few weeks ago, that a number of their councils and councillors are coming a bit unstuck already. But anyway, we'll talk about that perhaps on another occasion. But I do think that Nigel Farage, he's bound to say this. Of course, he wants to talk himself up and his party up. Totally get that. But under first past the post, it's not impossible, but it's going to be very difficult indeed for him to suddenly go from a party of 5 MPs to a party of several hundred and end up in government. Not impossible, but very, very tricky. So I don't think that is necessarily going to be the case. But do I think that for Reform voters, and obviously it's difficult for me to get into the mind of a Reform voter, but I shall try my best. I think for Reform voters, this week would have done him no good whatsoever. And as I say, he seems to be, last week talking about immigration, which was clearly a great appeal from him to Reform voters to say, it's okay, you can trust me, I'm going to stop these people coming in. And yet this week, in this reset with the EU, as I say, you talked about the youth mobility scheme and all of that. So these things don't seem to correspond with each other. And maybe last week was the Reform UK appeal to their voters week, and maybe this week is the appeal to Lib Dem voters week. Now, you may say that that's just clever politics, but actually, my view is that he ends up actually appealing to no one and satisfying no one. And I think there's quite a bit of desperation from what I read in number 10, and maybe even some friction in number 10, dare I say, allegedly, between Keir Starmer and his chief of staff, Morgan McSweeney, and perhaps others, about what the right strategy for Labour is. I think they recognise that they've not had a good start to their term in office and are now scrambling to try and win votes back. And I think that is partly why we're seeing some of the U-turns that you mentioned earlier on. But I think it's almost impossible, actually, for Labour to both satisfy the Reform vote and to satisfy the vote that's gone to the Lib Dems and to a lesser extent the Greens. I think we're talking about a very different set of political opinions. Now, and also, I don't think necessarily that Keir Starmer has the political skill to be able to do that. I think if we were talking,
No.
I think if we were talking, Chris, about Tony Blair, then I mean, again, whatever you thought about him, he was clearly someone of political skill and who was able to bring a coalition of voters together around the Labour Party or New Labour at that time that lasted for a decade or more. I don't think that Starmer has those skills, and so I do think that the government appears to be scrambling about trying to please different sets of voters. And again, I don't think he's, in terms of this Europe thing. Obviously, Reform will say he's capitulated. This is. He's trying to go back on Brexit. He never believed in it in the first place. And the Lib Dems will say, we welcome, any moves towards a closer relationship with Europe, but you've not gone far enough. So again, I don't know, Chris, who is really pleasing with this.
Yeah, and also Starmer's just explanations for things,
Right.
especially if you look at Chagos as well. The way he explains things, everybody knows he's talking absolute rubbish. And I think that just adds to the anger of people. And I think these decisions are going to anger people, and also the way in which Starmer tries to explain it as well just adds to that disillusionment with Labour.
I absolutely agree. And I mean, I try my best because obviously, we don't have a Labour representative on this podcast. So, I try my best to think what would be the government's view of these things and what's being said in Labour circles. And, I guess I ask myself, would Labour think that they've had a good week this week? And they probably do think they've had a pretty good week this week. But and clearly Starmer is more comfortable on the international stage than he is
he prefers Chagos to Westminster, and that might be the problem.
Well,
he said in an interview, I should say, he said that.
I do think that he does. No, I mean, I've no special problem personally with Davos, but he does seem to kind of epitomise kind of Davos man in that that sense. And I mean, I'm not one of these people who says, look at all the time he spends abroad. I mean, ultimately he's the Prime Minister and he will spend a significant amount of the time abroad. But I think he does seem to prefer that to the volleys being fired at him at home. I mean, that's understandable. Maybe we all would in that kind of situation. But ultimately, I think it is on domestic issues that he'll either be re-elected or not come 2029 in the next election. So, I mean, he can't forget the domestic situation. Just on Chagos then from me. I mean, I think I agree with you, Chris, in so much as that my view is that I believe in a nation's self-determination. And I think the one group of people conspicuous by their absence in terms of being in any way, from what I can tell at least, consulted as part of this decision has been the people of the Chagos Islands. And I think that is despicable and indefensible. That decisions are being made about, which is clearly going to have a great consequence for the population there, and that it's being done about them without them, and I think that really isn't good enough. And so, do I think this is the wrong decision, or at least do I think that it should have been? It may. I don't know enough about it in truth to know whether it's the right ultimate decision or not. But my point is, it should have been a decision taken with, and perhaps in best circumstances by the actual people of the Chagos Islands.
No, I'd agree with that, and it's supremely ironic that the text of the agreement talks about decolonisation, which I think is a key motivating factor here. The fact it's in the agreement just proves that. Starmer didn't mention that in his press conference, but it's there in black and white in the agreement, and yet they didn't consult. They didn't take any notice what the Chagosians want, and I think that's an additional bit of this whole episode, which is, in my opinion, disgraceful. But But I'm glad we're in agreement on that. I have plenty potentially to say on Chagos, but I think I'll leave it there before I before I get carried away and say something I regret.
Do you think, Chris, that Labour will think it's had a good week?
Probably, as I mean, I just can't. Okay, I think maybe, the EU agreement, they might think, oh, we're appealing to those voters that you highlighted, in the polling. So maybe it might think of that. I just cannot for the life of me understand why or how they would think that the Chagos agreement would go down well with the British public, apart from maybe they might think, well, most of the British population probably won't know where it is and probably don't care, which is patronizing and insulting. And I have no evidence that they've think that, but it's the only rationale, or apart from they're so ideologically committed to decolonization and this, that they're just going to press ahead with it anyway, and they don't care what the public thinks.
Yeah, I think people do care, and I think people cared about and still do about the Falkland Islands, and people care about Chagos and the Chagosian Islanders as well, and I mean, I don't pretend to be enough of an expert to know ultimately whether this is the right decision or not, but I do think that the people there should have been properly consulted, and I do think that it's a shameful episode actually for Keir Starmer and for this government, but I think that they'll be betting that not enough people care. Whether they're proven to be right or wrong on that, we'll see. I mean, do I think it'll be a deciding factor years down the line in the election? I mean, I don't particularly, but do I think it just adds to a general kind of theme about what people think about this Prime Minister? Yeah, I absolutely do.
The polling over the next few weeks is going to be fascinating, and we'll see whether this will have any effect on it at all. Labour's pretty low. Labour's ratings are pretty low. It's in like the early 20s. So can they fall any further? Well, the Tories have fallen below 20 now, so we'll have to see about that. Let's quickly do the remaining parties, shall we? So Reform UK, as they're leading in the polls, and they're leading by quite a bit at the moment. Now, there's one observation that I would make with regards to Reform's response and Reform and Nigel Farage's response, Nigel Farage's week, and that is, where was Nigel Farage? He wasn't Parliament sitting. Okay, they broke up on Thursday, but Nigel Farage was on holiday. And I just think, as you say, I'm on the right. I have sympathy with Reform, and I have sympathy with the Tories as well. But I do kind of despair about this, because it plays into this narrative about Nigel Farage that he's not serious. He's not presenting Reform as a potential government in waiting. He doesn't turn up, which he does normally, but on this occasion he very obviously didn't. So and also, I think this was, if there's one week in which you needed to be in the country, doing the media rounds, in Parliament, pressing the government, really doing campaigning about these things. As a Brexiteer, I wanted Nigel Farage to be on the airwaves all the time, just, barracking the governments left, right, and centre. And he wasn't here, and he wasn't doing it. And I'm very disappointed. So has Nigel Farage missed the trick here?
Well, he clearly has, Chris, from his perspective, or what you'd think to be from his perspective. I mean, I don't know if you remember when you were a kid, Chris. Where's Wally? I used to love Where's Wally, but it was where was this Wally? Where where was Nigel Farage? I mean, I'm amazed that he wasn't in Parliament this week and there to respond to that statement. I mean, this is absolutely, along with immigration, which is obviously tied into this to some extent. This is his party is raison d'etre. It's kind of why it exists. It's part of the reason why it's as popular as it is. His party is basically, the latest iteration of what was the Brexit party and kind of what was before that. UKIP is pretty much the same party, really. Farage likes to think that it was him more than anyone else that kind of, from his perspective, again, obviously not from mine, but that won the country's independence from the European Union, and yet where was he? He was nowhere to be seen. And when you're having to be being deputised, Chris, at Prime Minister's Questions by the dreadful Lee Anderson, I mean, things have reached a pretty sorry pass. And I think even you would have to agree that Starmer had, albeit it was no doubt a pre-planned line and a pre-scripted one, as these always are, but Starmer had quite a funny line about Farage being the first person to benefit from the new rules of the e-gates, wherever he was in the world. I thought that was quite funny. Political joke, there you are.
From them. Even though we benefit from them already, because my parents went through one last week, so
there we are.
So,
but I mean, where was he? And I do think that, as you were suggesting there, Chris, that it does make him look not entirely serious. And I think these are lessons that Reform need to learn. That if they do intend on being a major party and perhaps a party of government, they've got to be there on these big occasions. And if Farage is proposing himself, I mean, I dread this day, of course, personally, but if Farage is proposing himself as a future prime minister, you can't not be there. You can't just swan off. You've got to be there and lead. I wonder quite what Reform voters thought about that. I think it might have given them at least a brief moment's pause for thought, because it's just not really good enough, that.
Especially if there is this concern that people might have forgotten about Brexit or might be rethinking their vote. You need a brilliant campaigner, whatever you think of him. He is a brilliant campaigner like Farage, to make the arguments again, to remind people what the arguments are, to point out the flaws in the deal. No one can do that like Farage can do that. And I think the fact that he's absent this week is frustrating. Or the other argument is
sorry, Kevin, I just wanted to mention actually that I was, although his politics clearly weren't mine, I was very saddened this week to hear of the death of Patrick O'Flynn, the former Daily Express political editor, ardent Brexiteer, and later both UKIP and then SDP MEP. I had a number of good, really fun debates with him on social media, and despite the fact that we disagreed on pretty much everything, he seemed like a pretty good guy. And I think to have died in his late 50s is shocking, absolutely shocking. And I think actually he'll be missed by many across the spectrum.
Yeah, and he did seem. I had one or two interactions with him on Twitter, but he did seem like a genuinely nice person, and he was very well. You would expect this from a journalist. He was very, very good or an ex-journalist, because he was an MEP and then part of the SDP. I think he ended up with, but he was very good in the media as well, and he was important during the Brexit Party days. So
I think it's true to say as well, actually, that and again, clearly not a position that I personally agree with, but I think I'm right in saying it's been said this week that he got the Express to years before the actual Brexit vote and the referendum. He got the Express to support that political position, and that really it was pretty much the first national newspaper to do so. So I mean, from a journalistic perspective, clearly someone of great influence. But as I say, in the interactions that I had with him, there was never rancor. We just disagreed, and it was fun. And obviously, for his family and friends, just devastating, really.
Yeah, it's just things hit you, doesn't it? Very, very quickly, and it's just a reminder that how fragile life is, really. It's going to be strange without him on the political commentary scene. He was a big part of
it
the right-wing
absolutely is, and he was one of those people actually that although clearly I disagreed with him on pretty much everything. I always kind of enjoyed whenever he was on the media, because he was very articulate. He clearly passionately believed in the views that he held. It wasn't in any way formative with him, and it would have been really interesting to have continued to hear his views on these interesting times. And he's the kind of person actually that I would have really loved to have been able to invite on this podcast. And of course, we won't now be able to do so. So yeah, I mean, I just wanted to pay tribute to him, as I think people have done from across the political scene this week. We must move on to the other parties, but yeah, I mean, I think that was clearly a mistrick for Reform, Chris, and I think that from their perspective, at least, they need to do better on these things.
Yeah. And that moves. Leads us nicely to the Conservatives, given that Reform wasn't as vocal as it could have been or should have been. Does this present Kemi Badenoch with an opportunity? Is this her make or break moment? If she can lead the charge on both either this EU deal or the Chagos deal, and really kind of gets the opposition to it into the public imagination, is this an opportunity for her to effectively save her leadership?
Well, she certainly needs to do something, doesn't she, Chris? And really quite quickly, in my view. I mean, I know we're not talking this week about the fuel allowance U-turn, but I've just got to mention that her PMQs. I mean, it was just really weird. I mean, it was just weird. I mean, he'd in answer to clearly a planting question, but in answer to a backbencher, he'd made clear that there was going to be some kind of U-turn on this. And yet, Badenoch didn't seem to have the ability or the capability to be able to then change her questions. And you've got to be able to do that at PMQs.
And the annoying thing was that she had him. Like, she had him. She was asking him about is there going to be any tax rises in future spring statements and budgets. And in the future budget, and Starmer couldn't answer. He didn't answer. He was very uncomfortable in answering that question. And yet, again, she does this. I'm afraid she does this. She has him on the ropes, and then she moves on to something else. And I don't get it. I appreciate that it's very easy for us to criticize when from our armchairs or anything, and the pressure must get to her. It's very difficult to think on the spot like that, but that's what she's paid for at the end of the day. And
it absolutely is. And it was interesting that, and I appreciate that Ed Davey, has a couple of minutes to sit there and think about things before asking his questions. But he did kind of move the issue on. He asked, will this be changed in full? And that kind of moved the question on. I mean, I agree. I mean, that is the hothouse of Westminster, and neither me or you have experienced what it must be like to stand there as the leader of the opposition. But but me and you have both been kind of decades-long viewers of Prime Minister's questions, and you've got to be able to think on your feet. You've got to be able to change your approach. And surely, Chris, you'd agree with this as well, is that, you know, they obviously do a lot of, you'd expect they do a lot of prep for PMQs. I'm sure they do.
Yeah.
And you would have thought that it must be something like this. Well, if he answers this, you can then ask this. If he answers this, you can then ask this. And yet she doesn't seem quite capable to make
it's
that
worse
switch.
than that. It's worse than that. It's a really basic thing. You can tell that Starmer's squirming. You can tell he doesn't want to answer the question. Then it's just a very simple response to ask him the question again and to drill down. And she doesn't seem to be able to do that. So
in terms of her getting back to, you know, our subject of the week. I mean, again, I can't pretend to have heard a great deal from the Tories this week. I mean, again, you know, I think that Badenoch was clearly trying to appeal to Reform voters in saying, you know, this is rolling back on Brexit, and this is, you know, 17 point some odd million people that he's letting down. But again, it's interesting, isn't it, that with both of the two main party leaders at the moment, that I wonder if most people believe either of them, actually. And I think it's no wonder why other parties are doing well, mostly Reform, but the Lib Dems and to a lesser extent the Greens as well. Is that people just don't believe either of the two main party leaders,
and especially among Brexiteers, because what's the criticism of the Tories? Well, you had Brexit, you were responsible for Brexit, you had an 80-seat majority, and okay, the initial negotiations they didn't, and that's where all of the problems with the 2019 election came in. But the British public instructed them to enact Brexit, and they messed it up, and they messed up having an 80-seat majority as well. So you can understand why Tory Reform converts are saying, well, we're not going to trust you again because we trusted you once with this and you messed up. So we're not going to be stupid enough to trust you again. So Badenoch, even with the difficulties with the leadership and her presentation, she did do a press conference with Victoria Atkins, and again, it's like they're trying, but there's something missing, you know. And but even with that, they then got the hurdle of people saying, well, you didn't do much when you were in government, or you messed up in government. Well, we trusted you with Brexit, and look what happened. So
I mean, maybe, and I think we've talked about this. I can't remember, Chris, whether we talked about this on air or the last time that we met up in person. But I mean, you know, I know we have talked in the recent past about whether I think it was when we met up in person. Actually, so we'll let our viewers and listeners into this. But whether there does need to be at some point a leadership change, and it needs to be someone who wasn't involved in the last government, and that is the only way from their perspective, from a Conservative perspective, to hopefully have some ballast against the obvious Labour charge, which was on all of these things. You had 14 years.
It would be, as we said, it would be a bold and radical move, but again, what else can they do against that very powerful counter argument and charge against them? I think given that time is running short, I think maybe we will have to change the order, because the Lib Dems always get off in our episodes so far. But very quickly on the Lib Dems, what do you think of the Lib Dem reaction? And I put it to you, I made this point earlier in a different way, but I'll put it to you again. In 2019, the Lib Dems did brilliantly in the European elections, for them, and I think in the local elections as well during that year. And then, and I think it was that led them to be overconfident, and for them to rather stupidly and counterproductively for them to agree to the general election, where they got smashed again. And do you think actually this time this is actually pressing the Labour governments to do more on integration, on integrating us more with the EU? Is that now the right approach, or are they repeating the mistake that they made in 2019? Is all very well doing well in the polls, is all very well doing well in the local elections, but when the British public feels strongly, when the British public feel that politicians are not respecting votes, are not respecting a democratic vote, then they ultimately punish the parties who are trying to change that. So what do you think there?
Well, I think the Lib Dems. I mean, I think, as I said on Talk last weekend, I think ground is opening up for the Lib Dems and to a lesser extent the Greens, for people that are broadly pro-immigration, or at least agnostic on it, and that are pro-European, and who greatly regret the fact that the country voted to leave the European Union. I think there were specific problems with the 2019 campaign and with the leadership of Joe Swinson, which I won't go into now, but I think those were a very specific set of issues. I mean, if I can just get a little plug in, Chris, which I know you'll allow me to, that in my debut column for Lib Dem Voice this past Monday, Google it, folks, you can find it. I called for us to be on a whole range of issues much kind of bolder and braver than we sometimes are. And as part of that column, I said that, look, why are we not saying what is self-evidently our view as a party, and that is that, albeit that we don't expect this to happen in the short term, because we don't, but our clear view is, and should be stated, that of course ultimately we want to rejoin the European Union. I don't know why we sometimes kind of underplay that or downplay it. That is clearly our view as Liberal Democrats, and I think we're going to be appealing not just to kind of natural Lib Dems who obviously would have that point of view, but to a lot of the people that we are seeing now, saying that they have buyer's regret about Brexit, and that they do now kind of wish that there'd been a different decision made. We can hoover up some of those votes as well. So, I mean, I do hope that on this and a range of other issues, Ed Davey and Daisy Cooper and others are a wee bit braver than they have perhaps recently been in terms of how they put forward our policies and our values.
Right. I think we're out of time. There's obviously a lot more I could say, but I put forward my substantive point in that there is a risk with that the public could always turn. And it tended, perhaps for the Lib Dems, turned rather unexpectedly in 2019. But at the same time, it's 2025, so you never know. Right. I think we're out of time, but it's been an interesting week. It's been a very eventful week. I've been hopping mad, as you would have seen, Mathew, on my Twitter, as you pointed out to me.
You have. I was worried for your health at one point.
Yeah. Well, I don't know if Starmer's good for anybody's health, to be honest, but
well, I mean, yeah, I can't get to grips, to be honest with you, with this Prime Minister and what he aims to achieve as Prime Minister, other than thinking that he should be Prime Minister. Well, that's all well and good. Nothing wrong with being ambitious, that's fine. But I don't know what his kind of overarching kind of theme is for his time in Number 10. And again, he just seems to be upsetting more and more different groups of voters. So we'll see.
He's upset everybody now. He's pretty. I don't know who else he hasn't upset. But anyway, we're out of time. As Mathew always says.
Yes. Do all the it's kind of my catchphrase now. So do all the internety things. Like, subscribe, follow us on @Frenemies on Twitter. Do all of those things. Our audience is growing, and especially for the shorts that Chris, bless him, labours over and puts out for us. They're getting some quite high viewing figures for us, which is great. But whether you're watching or listening, we really appreciate it. And who knows what we'll be talking about next week. But obviously, so Parliament's off, so that may mean things are a wee bit quieter. But something will happen, won't it, Chris?
Yeah, they're always. I mean, in the last silly seasons that we've had, there's always been something. Even during the summer there was riots, weren't there? Well, hopefully that won't happen this time.
No.
But there's always news. There's always something going on in British politics. But
have a good week.
Have a good week, yeah. And it's goodbye from me.
And it's goodbye from me, folks. Take care.
We'll see you next time on Political Frenemies.